My name is Claire Elizabeth Ramsey. I am 22 years old. I live in a small, weather-beaten duplex on the east side of Akron, Ohio, 2 blocks from a diner that still smells like bacon at dawn and a laundromat that never seems to close. Right now my life is a strange mixture of boxes, a half-empty suitcase, and a diploma that feels both like armor and a raw nerve. Emotionally, I am exhausted but wired, like someone who has just run a marathon and then had to answer questions about why they were running. I'm trying to be gentle with myself, and some nights I let myself believe I'm on the other side of the worst thing my family ever said to me. Other nights the words are a steady throb behind my ribs. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. If I start at graduation, it's because that's when everything split open in front of an audience. The morning smelled like cut grass and cheap cologne. The stadium roof was open and the sun hit the bleachers, making everyone squint. There were the usual sounds. Muffled applause, a kid playing a trumpet, a row over off-key, the rustling of programs. My cap tassel ticked against my ear like a metronome counting down something inevitable. I had taken the same bus route since high school, watched the same corner bar get painted the same tired red, and memorized the way the horizon looks as if it could swallow you whole if you lean into it. That morning everything felt significant and fragile at once. My parents had not come to many of my school events. They had come early once to a play when I was 12, and once to a parent-teacher conference that turned into a shouting match in the parking lot. Yet they promised to be there for graduation. Dad texted a thumbs-up emoji. Mom said, "We'll be there, Claire." I kept rehearsing my speech under my breath. I had written about resilience and about the people who built me. I thought of my little brother, who was 12 and sat in the second row, clutching a folded paper hat. I want to be honest. The graduation wasn't just a ceremony, it was a hinge. I had worked 2 jobs through college, taken loans, and scraped by on nights where ramen bowls were dinners, and my essays were written after midnight under the blue glow of a desk lamp. I had thought about not inviting them. I thought of walking across that stage without looking at their faces. But hope, or maybe a foolish kind of optimism, made me believe they might be proud. It seemed like a rare chance to heal something I had been carrying like a stone for years. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. The speech was the other hinge. I didn't plan to call them out. I used the word we a lot. We learned, we stumbled, we found a way. Because that's how you frame triumphs for an audience. I was tired of being the we in our family, the one who swallowed explanations for silence. When I said thank you to my parents, I meant it, partly, and I meant it because gratitude was the only language I had left in public for the complicated mess they were. They were in the crowd, a pair of dark silhouettes against the sun. My stomach did that particular sick twist that feels like someone has opened a window inside you. When the principal called my name, my palms were slick. The applause felt distant, like it was happening in a room around me, not on my skin. My feet found the steps, my gown brushed the plastic chairs. There was a scent, hot concrete and faint grills from the food trucks outside, like summer trapping itself in a single afternoon. I remember a woman standing up behind me, sobbing quietly, and a man in a suit adjusting his cufflinks nervously. I remember thinking, for a single miraculous heartbeat, that maybe whatever clouds had always hung over my childhood had thinned. Then the words came. Not from a stranger but from the 2 people who were supposed to be my home. "We wish you were never born." They were not a whisper. They were not private. My ears registered them as if through thick water, and then, like a broken speaker, every sound amplified. Somebody laughing too loud, the chirp of a stroller wheel, the flutter of a loose program in a gust. My throat closed so fast I couldn't breathe properly. The cap felt like a crown made of something brittle. I stared at them. Dad's face was red, veins visible at his temple, and Mom's mouth trembled like a guilty bird. For a second I thought it was a mistake, a slip of language, a dark attempt at a joke. Then my brother looked at me, eyes wide and bright, and because he was still a child he didn't understand the camouflage of emotion adults wear, and the words settled into me like weight. I left the stage holding my diploma like something I had to keep from slipping. People clapped. Some faces were blurry through the hot, pricking sensation in my eyes. I remember thinking that the entire crowd had become a witness to the end of something private, like looking through a window at a house on fire. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. You'll see why I couldn't go home that night, why the house felt like someone else's memory. When I try to explain my childhood, the details come back in texture. Smells, small fixtures, repeated movements that become the architecture of a life. Our house was a 2-story brick with a porch rail that needed painting. It smelled faintly of coffee, motor oil, and the plastic of old toys. There was a faded poster of Lake Erie on the wall and a calendar of a fishing boat that my dad never took us on. My mother kept the curtains half closed. She believed light made things too visible. He was a man with a laugh that could fill a room and a short fuse that could empty it. My father, Mark Ramsey, worked as a mechanic at a garage that stayed open late. He taught me how to change oil and how to keep count of screws, which is probably why I still find order in small tasks. My mother, Evelyn, was soft in ways that could be weaponized. She knew exactly how to look like she needed comfort and then make someone else feel like they had failed by offering it. They loved, I think, with the kind of ferocity that doesn't always take the shape of care. The fights started long before I could name them. They were threaded into holidays, into dinner conversations that ended with slammed doors. When I was 10, my father left for 3 months. He told us it was work trouble, and then later that he needed space. We had a card on the fridge where we tracked him like a schedule. Back on Monday, gone again Thursday. My mother kept everything in list form. Her lists were a religion. My brother, David, learned to shut his room's door silently so he could pretend not to hear. I learned early that I could tidy a room, pack a lunch, and fix the heater. Actions that were pragmatic, like bandages. I learned that being good sometimes became a currency in a household that ran on blame. When I started high school, I took those small skills to work at the diner. The regulars knew me by name. I learned their orders by heart. Black coffee, no cream. Over easy rye toast. I made enough money to pay for textbooks and the occasional movie ticket. I kept my grades up because it felt like a way to make my world coherent. There were betrayals that built like erosion. Once, when I was 16, I found bank statements hidden in a shoebox. The numbers were tangled in my mother's handwriting and my father's name. There were payments, late fees, and one emptied account. They told me later they'd had hard times. But they also told friends at church that we were doing fine, and they smiled at each other at weddings like everything was normal. That duplicity was a wound I nursed quietly. I learned to be a peacemaker because it made the shouting stop. If I called my father at work and asked a question that diffused his anger, it meant dinner stayed whole. I became meticulous in sandbagging emotional landmines. My mother would sometimes make remarks about how my life had been easier than hers. Her voice like a knife. "You had opportunities," she'd say. "I didn't have that." She never said thank you the way a parent might. "You made my life harder," she did say, once in a particularly acoustic silence after a school award ceremony. The echo of that sentence hung in me and shaped the way I moved through the world. By the time college applications came around, I was tired and hopeful in equal measure. I got a scholarship to a state university. No small miracle. I remember the acceptance letter smelled like fresh ink and possibility. I was the first in my family to go. They were proud in the way people are proud of trophies behind glass. Yet pride doesn't always translate to support. My father would not attend campus tours. My mother asked only practical questions about how much it would cost, so we know if it's manageable. They were not absent because they didn't love, but because their love had been co-opted by fear, by a sense of defeat they wore like a second skin. They believed, in some private ledger, that I had taken something from them by wanting something different. If this is resonating with you, a like really helps us reach more people. You're not alone in this feeling of being both indebted and invisible. There were moments of tenderness, undeniably. Late-night conversations with my dad about the best way to strip paint, and my mom teaching me how to sew a button back on a blouse. But tenderness in our house was often mixed with a ledger of grievances. Every kindness had a price, and every mistake had a receipt fastened to it. I carried the receipts like talismans, reading them in my head at night until sleep came like a small, exhausted forgiveness. The secret that no one in our household talked about openly was that my parents' relationship had been derailed long before I was born. They'd had a child young, thrown into bills and obligations, and both carried a smoldering resentment for dreams abandoned. Whether they blamed me or themselves changed from day to day, but the burn was always there. My mother confessed once, through tears and a half-empty bottle of wine, that she had missed college classes because she had been pregnant. She said it like a verdict, and the room filled with a presence that demanded someone absorb that guilt. The person she chose, often silently, was me. I started to understand that the cruelty I received, barbed comments, cold silences, and later the public declaration at my graduation, wasn't only about me. It was about a history of frustration and lost chance. But understanding doesn't equal permission. Knowing their pain didn't make their words any less sharp when they were thrown at me like stones on a sunny day. It did, however, complicate the anger I felt. It mixed it with a terrible compassion that I couldn't decide whether to honor or reject. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. It's strange and awful how sharing can thin the isolation. In the next part, I'll tell you what happened on the lawn after those words landed like a slap, and how my family started to unravel in the open. After the words, the world seemed to rearrange itself around the sound. People kept clapping as if rituals could repair ruptures. My brother, David, sat with his paper hat crumpled in his hands, and I watched my knees go weak. The diploma suddenly felt like a shield I forgot to raise in time. My father's face hardened in a way that made him look older, like someone unglued from a life he had agreed to but no longer recognized. My mother looked away, her fingers twisting the edge of her program so hard the paper creased. I went home that evening because I had to, because there were boxes with my name on them and 1,000 small necessary tasks. But home was thin and foreign. The familiar furniture took on the soft patina of witnesses. The afternoon sun slanted through the curtains and painted the kitchen table in lines. The smell of coffee lingered like a memory machine. The silence between my parents was now a kind of armor. At dinner, my father ate mechanically, his jaw moving, the muscle of resentment forming a hardness I couldn't soften with jokes. My mother sat expressionless, eyes on the plate, and when I tried to speak their faces were islands. Why would you say that in front of everyone? I asked because sometimes when the thermometer is high you test the heat. My voice sounded small and too steady. They needed to know, my father said, as if airing the grievance in public made it truer. Someone had to get it out. It wasn't your place, I said, and I felt the old habit of mediating the room rise like bile. It wasn't our place either. Why say that right then, right there? My mother looked at me with eyes so cold I could feel them. You think you're so brave, she said, walking around like you built everything yourself. You left him to take care of everything. You think you can just walk away and expect a round of applause? I had already been trying to leave for months. I had applied for an internship in another city, arranged a sublet, packed references, and saved each spare dollar in an envelope I hid at the back of the sock drawer. I'd asked for help with a security deposit and been told, in that same crisp way that indicates a verdict, that they couldn't afford it. The subtext had always been the same. My leaving was abandonment. My staying was my duty. My father's voice was low and dangerous. You think we didn't sacrifice, he said. Do you know what it's like to watch everything we've worked for go down the drain because you wanted something else? I remember the room tilting. The plates did not fit correctly in my hands. My brother's fork clattered on the table like a bell. The argument devolved into a litany of accusations, each phrase a well-practiced blow. The neighbor's dog barked outside like accompaniment to the scene. At one point, my brother stood up and bolted from the room. I heard him run down the porch stairs, the slap of sneakers on wood, his small frame disappearing into twilight. I should have followed him. We did not sleep that night. My parents retreated into different corners, literal and psychic. My mother watched television with its sound down low, My father left the house and came back smelling of motor oil and cold air. When he came in, I asked the question that had been grinding at me all day. "Why did you say it?" He didn't look at me. "Because it's true," he said finally. "We were stuck. You being born changed everything. It didn't give us happy endings." The cruelty of the sentence was that it was both an accusation and a confession. There was a nakedness to it that made me dizzy. Had they genuinely thought those words like a truth? Or had they been thrown like bait to see if I'd react? Their contempt was old and familiar. The public airing of it was new and humiliating. In the days after the ceremony, our family became, in some ways, a spectacle. Relatives called. My aunt said, "You should forgive them. They were probably ashamed of their own choices." Strangers at the grocery store offered awkward sympathy. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." My timeline filled with messages. "Are you okay?" And "What happened?" I found that people wanted to be on the side of empathy. And yet empathy in the abstract never replaces the rawness of a wound. I went to therapy because my roommate, someone who had seen me collapse into myself many nights during finals, refused to listen to me spiral alone. The therapist's office was a small, sunlit room with ferns on the sill and a notebook that waited like a neutral judge. Saying the words out loud, "My parents said they wish I had never been born," was an act of unburdening I hadn't expected to do. The therapist, a woman with kind eyes and an earnest way of repeating phrases, asked me what I wanted. The question was both merciful and terrifying. "I want to be free of their voice," I said. "But I also want them to understand that you don't get to decide whether someone exists." She smiled a little, the kind of smile that says, "This is a start. What they said reflects their pain, not your value," she said. The sentence felt sanitized, but I clung to it like a rope. My brother, David, was caught in the crossfire of choosing loyalty to the parents who raised him or to the sister who had been his refuge. He vacillated. Some nights he'd sleep over at my room. Other nights he would not. I would wake to the sound of his muffled breathing in the hallway, and feel both the warmth of connection and the sharpness of a fracture that had happened because someone had issued a verdict on my existence. During this period, messages began to appear. Texts from old friends, from acquaintances, from professors who had seen me as capable and bright. The scale between private horror and public affirmation made me dizzy. People told me they loved my valedictory line about resilience, and that I'd inspired them. The gap between what my family said and what the world reflected back at me was a chasm both alarming and, strangely, liberating. After the fallout of graduation, I started looking for reasons in the corners my parents left unlit. I dug through old photo albums, asked neighbors the kinds of small questions kids don't usually think to ask adults. When did Dad stop singing? When did Mom start closing the curtains? I found a stack of letters in a shoebox under the bed that my parents had never meant for me to see. Their tax returns, some eviction notices, and a single brittle postcard from a woman named Lauren, sent from a town 3 hours away. I learned that my parents had been fighting about money long before I arrived, and that the friction wasn't mine alone to own. But there was another revelation that made my stomach drop. When I was 5, a paternity test had been done, one of those quiet, ugly family decisions, and the results were never disclosed. The test had been hidden. I remember the small, silenced argument about truth that led to the secrecy. My mother had folded the paper and put it into a drawer. My father had insisted no one else needed to know. For years I balanced on a narrative that was partial and slanted by omission. When I finally confronted him, one rainy afternoon, standing at the sink while rain ran like a slow hand down the window frame, my father first denied it. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. Then he shifted to anger and finally to weary confession. "We thought it was better to keep some things to ourselves," he murmured like an apology that also wanted to be a defense. "You were a child. We protected you." The discovery changed nothing about the cruelty of the words at graduation. Whether or not their anger had been about biological parenthood, whether or not their buy-in to resentment had roots in deeper immobility, it didn't make it less violent. But it did change the way I tried to understand them. For the first time, the roiling resentment had a name: regret. I started researching families who had hidden things like this, who had kept secrets for reasons both pragmatic and cowardly. It read like a catalogue of damage. My father had lost a job when I was young and had tried to patch things up with odd evening gigs. My mother's bitterness, the postcard suggested, had once been aimed at herself. The postcard from Lauren was an apology she never delivered. In it, apologies and the promise of reconnecting, words that landed like rain on old soil and did not heal as intended. I brought the postcard to my mother. She looked at it the way someone might look at a photograph of themselves as a teenager, tender and ashamed. "I wanted to be other things," she said. "I wanted to study, to leave, to do anything but be here and raise you and keep house. Then when you came, there was no right way. I resented that. I resented that the world had made me choose." "It's not your fault, Mom," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. I wanted to offer her absolution like a clean cloth. She refused it. "Don't say that," she said, and the rejection was another kind of wound. "Don't pretend it was easy for me either." These truths should have paved the way to reconciliation. Instead, they complicated everything. Knowing your parents' pain doesn't make their lashing any less damaging. It might make you extend a hand, but it might also lead you to step back when the hand is offered alongside a barb. I remember sitting in the laundromat one night folding clothes and holding a letter I had written but not sent. The dryer hummed like a low, comforting friend. I had drafted an explanation and a list of boundaries and a demand for respect. I wanted to be honest without being cruel. Carried the words like a risk. My parents, meanwhile, were each dealing with their shame in their own ways. My father started drinking more often. Not secretly, like an open wound that everyone could see, but with the resigned regularity of someone who had declared themselves finished. My mother began going to a support group at the church. She told me once she felt less alone there, like communal confession lowered the weight a bit. It was surprising, and for a moment I felt something like hope. David, my brother, was the hardest to read. At 12, he oscillated between idolizing me and inhaling the pressure of our household. He started to perform better at school, perhaps to anchor a future I had given him. He also started to mimic my mother in small, cruel ways, snapping phrases I had once heard adults say about me. Children learn faster than adults want to admit. One night, after a particularly brittle Thanksgiving, I told my parents I was leaving. I had the deposit money in an envelope and the keys to an apartment half a city away. My father laughed hollowly and asked, "Does this mean you're happy now?" My mother didn't look up. "Don't do this to us," she said. "You're my daughter." "I don't want to do this to anyone," I said. "I want to do this for myself." When I walked out of that house carrying 2 duffel bags and a small plant I'd managed to keep alive, I felt a physics of release and a physics of gravity. The air outside seemed colder and cleaner, like a lung filling for the first time in too long. I could hear the familiar radio across the street playing some old country song, and for a moment the world was both ordinary and extraordinary. Has something like this ever happened to you? If it has, please know that you're seeing someone who still carries scars. If you're comfortable, share. This community helps me feel less alone. I started to rebuild there, slow as a tide. The first months after I left were a study in small, deliberate comforts. My new apartment was a studio with paint the color of a pale apology, and a landlord named Rosa who kept a jar of fresh cookies in the lobby. The scent of brewed coffee from a shop below became a new kind of background music to my mornings. I worked at a non-profit tutoring center, a job that paid less than my potential but felt like a purpose. I learned to make a grilled cheese that didn't burn, and I learned the worth of silence that isn't shared with accusation. Therapy continued. It became a place where I could put my experiences into sentences that didn't explode like grenades. One day my therapist told me something that has stuck. Words are both knives and maps. Sometimes what people say cuts to mark a path away from them. Sometimes it points to a place where their own pain is buried. That didn't fix my parents. It did give me a framework for what I needed to do. Map a path without making myself the fulcrum on which their guilt balanced. My relationship with my parents became defined by boundaries. There were phone calls with time limits. Visits that were planned and structured. No more midnight texts demanding explanations or love as a debt. Protecting my mental health meant getting comfortable being accused of coldness. I sat with that accusation like a patient in the waiting room of my own life. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. Mostly, I answered it with the consistent thing I'd learned to do. Choose me. We tried, tentatively, to build a new kind of civility. My mother and I took a cooking class once. Two awkward silhouettes chopping onions and exchanging guarded conversation. She brought up the postcard one day with the kind of shame that makes your throat clamp. We talked about what she'd lost and what she had left. I forgave in increments, not because I had to, but because I wanted relief. Forgiveness became less about them and more about unburdening myself. My father wasn't ready for that same kind of softness. He and I had a conversation, one of many, that ended with no tidy reconciliation. He told me, I was a young man and I made the wrong choices. That may have been true, but it didn't undo the words he'd spoken. We agreed to be distant for a time, and that distance was both a wound and a balm. David, in contrast, found his footing in ways that surprised me. He received a scholarship to a tech program and developed a quiet confidence. Sometimes he'd call in the early morning with a small triumph. I fixed the neighbor's router, and I'd feel like the sister who had made space for something good to grow. He loved me in ways that were messy and bright and his own. He wasn't entirely free from the echoes of what had happened, but he chose his steps differently. I dated a little, cautiously at first, then with a braver heart. There was one person, Lena, who held a particular patience and a willingness to listen to the parts of me that were still raw. She didn't try to fix me. She simply sat with the pieces as if they were a puzzle we might someday finish together. Sometimes I would recount the story of my graduation aloud to her, and she'd listen with a tenderness that felt nearly sacred. There were setbacks. Sometimes when my parents called, something in me would revert to old patterns. Tightness around the chest, the impulse to explain, to please. I would have to remind myself that being kind does not require erasing boundaries. I would also remind myself that their worst words were about their own fear, not about my worth. Over time, the weight of those words, "We wish you were never born," lost their ability to define me. They remained like a scar, a reminder of where I had been and what I had survived. But I started to imagine my life without that echo as the primary soundtrack. I started to plan for a career that didn't rely on their approval. I started to build a community that loved me for the person I was, not the one I'd been told to be. One afternoon, years after the stadium sun and the papery rustle of applause, I visited the park where they had held a small ceremony for my brother's middle school graduation. The air was warm, and the sycamore leaves made patterned shadows on the pavement. I sat on a bench and breathed like someone learning new measures. Grief was still present, an undercurrent, but something new had also arrived. Resilience that was not reactive but intentional. If this story has touched you, please subscribe and share. Sometimes your kindness makes a small, real difference. If you are the person whose parents have said something like this, I hope you can hear me when I say, you are not defined by what they say. You are defined by the life you choose to build in response. Protect your heart. Seek help. Surround yourself with people who say, plainly, you matter. In the end, my parents and I did not have a cinematic reconciliation. There were no sweeping apologies that fixed everything. What happened was slower, like the way a wound scabs and then, over time, becomes something that you can look at without losing your breath. There were gestures of care and blunders, and a great deal of quiet continuing. My lesson, one I have to remind myself of daily, is that families are complicated constellations. They can hurt you and they can also be the reason you learn how to fly. Thank you for staying with me through this. If anything in my story resonates with you, leave a comment. I'm reading everyone. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Sharing our truths is how we stop being islands.